magic deal happen for us. Counsel for Secure Justice, the entire team from Delhi and Enfold. And it gives us great pleasure to bring Sujatha to you. And I would like to, of course, I have a formal introduction, but before I go there, I want to share that the first time I met Sujatha was in 2016, and I, walked into her home. I said, Sujatha, India's response to criminal justice is very punitive in nature. Can you help us out here? And immediately she was like, I'm ready to come to India. So 2016 is when Sujatha graciously came to India and trained first group of people on restorative justice, restorative circles, and since then, our journey with her has continued. Work in India has also flourished in the area of restorative justice. We have many, many more people joining us in this journey, and a lot of, I think, if I have to talk about the movement of restorative justice in India, I think Sujatha is a big part of that story. Definitely for us, those of us who work in the space of child rights. I don't think we can talk about restorative justice in India without talking about Sujatha. So here's a formal introduction to Sujatha. Sujatha's work is characterized by an equal dedication to people who have experienced and caused harm and violence. A former victim advocate and public defender, she's a frequent guest lecturer at various universities and conferences. She's worked for decades in the space of restorative justice. She speaks publicly and inside prisons about her own experience as a survivor of child sexual abuse and her path to forgiveness. In her most recent position, directing the Restorative Justice Project, Sujatha helps communities across the US implement restorative justice alternatives to youth criminalization. Today, she is exploring restorative justice approaches to ending intimate partner and sexual violence. Sujatha is a member of the Pluto Foundation in Richmond, California, where she leads meditation on Monday nights. She lives in Northern California with her lovely partner, Jason, of 27 years, and her beautiful son, Satya, who some of us have also met. In 2019, Sujatha was named the MacArthur Fellow, and she's writing her first book, and it gives us great joy to have her with us today. Just a few housekeeping announcements. Please make sure your phones are on silent. We do have participants online. We request you to also remain muted while Sujatha speaks and drop in your questions on the chat box. In case you have difficulties hearing Sujatha, you can please let us know and we will try and sort out the text. Request patience from everybody online and in person if there are any tech challenges. So thank you everyone. Over to you, Sujatha.
Thank you, everyone. So good to be here. It's really just been a joy, this journey of connecting with organizations across India. Particular thanks to Enfold, to Counsel for Secure Justice, my early partners to support NCAP today, for sponsoring this event. So do we have the slides go live? Oh, here. So I've been here for a few months now. I was in Dharamshala for 2 months working on my book and getting to connect with an amazing organization there called the Tibetan Center for Conflict Resolution, and they are also having a growing interest in restorative justice. And then spent a week in Delhi with some professors here with all of you. After this morning, actually, we'll be straight into more advanced training on how to work with people who experience harm, people who cause harm, and starting to prepare them for a direct dialogue, which I'll be talking a little bit about today. So just really enjoyed it. So a little bit about this picture. In the U.S., when we start restorative justice process, we often go around and introduce ourselves and start with a notion of gratitude. And when I first moved to Oakland, California, the children there would use this expression saying, "Whose shoulders do you stand on?" And I just noticed in my heart some a little bit of discomfort in that. I thought I didn't like the idea of my feet touching my elbows. It was like this little Indian hang up. And so I started to say both of these things at the same time. So whose feet do I touch and whose shoulders do I stand on? And so for me, every single thing I tell you, first, there's two things. I often feel like a charlatan on two fronts. One is that every single thing I tell you is something that I have gained from somebody else, just like a hodgepodge of what I've learned from amazing Maori, from Aotearoa, New Zealand, amazing restorative justice practitioners there, from the man who coined the phrase restorative justice, Howard Thayer, who's a Mennonite man from a very old sect of Christianity in the U.S. That thinks a great deal about reconciliation and healing. And they're very similar to Amish people, like the Amish, and that's what sort of came up with this original word restorative justice and what the original practices in that sort of Western frame looks like in the U.S. And then from Navajo people, Justice Yazzie. Robert Yazzie was the Chief Justice of the Navajo Supreme Court. He walked away from his role as Chief of the Supreme Court because he was very interested in understanding a more decolonized approach to justice in the community. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but he's been an incredible teacher for me in how to go about healing and moving forward after even the worst things we've done to one another. So these are some of the feet I touch, whose shoulders I stand on in my work, and really everything I credit to them. And the other thing I said to Sir Charlotte, and for those of you who want to watch the talk, you literally see some of the exact same slides. So I'm saying that you may have seen in past talks. The truth is that, the news hasn't changed so much. We're still moving forward in these same concepts. And I to add more of what I've learned in the past 15, 20 years of work in the social justice point to some of the same concepts that we're doing. So we also, after we talk a little bit about whose shoulders we're standing on, and we're sitting in this work process, everyone comes together, we talk a little about who are you and why are you? And that is in and of itself a trust building experience. So, for example, when we are talking about what has happened to us, what we are grappling with in our community, if only one person is sharing what happens to them, then their vulnerability is there to allow us to all share. And so pretty early on, we start to just open up a little bit about what it is that brings us to the work. And I really love this quote by Lilla Watson, who's an Aboriginal woman from there in Australia. And she says, if you come here to help me, you are wasting our time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And so this really moved me. I remember times in my own life when I felt a very patronizing desire to fix me by people who consider themselves superior to me, either by age or by race or by some other status, title. And those kinds of feelings in the work made me clamor. But when I felt that someone was invested in our collective liberation, that I felt that they call it in Oakland, they said, you have the game. That is something that I find really moving. This notion that you are deeply, almost physically invested in my liberation, in your liberation. That makes me feel like I can trust you to do the collective work of helping us all get more food for our suffering. So one of the things I really love about this quote, which I apparently shouldn't use, is because I've heard that she was really disturbed when she became famous for this. She said, this is not my thinking, this is a saying in my people, stop citing me. And so in the US, we're so individualistic, right? And so you don't put a picture of an Aboriginal, or you use an Aboriginal quote without saying, well, who said it, and you're not giving credit to this person. And then she's coming from a completely different perspective of, why would you credit it to one person? It's a collective process. And so I just need to name that distinction and sort of the tension I feel when I took this quote. And even that tension, how it helps us understand the roots of what it is that we're doing. Yeah. So who am I and why am I here? Oh, what happened? Come back. Oh, okay, great. So this is a little bit old data, which interestingly stopped keeping it. India has also stopped keeping it. The report many of us, like maybe some of the audience can correct me. The report I cited from India is almost maybe 15, 20 years old now about the rate of child sexual abuse and whether or not it's being properly addressed in systems that are offered. This is some older data from the US. And in the early 2000s, we discovered that varies by jurisdiction, but in 100 cases of child sexual abuse, let's say, depending on the jurisdiction, between 10 to 18 are reported to authorities, and this includes like schools and all kinds of different things, police, child protective services, all of it, maybe 10 to 18, so some 90% are just nothing is happening, like nobody is finding out about, okay? Then from there, and I don't think some people are hiding more than 6% or so are even prosecuted, let alone convicted. And when we say convicted, we mean maybe somebody pled guilty to some lesser included offense. It's not even the thing for which they'd actually done, right? And then even in that, then the conviction rate is marginal, meaning reoffense is marginally improved, right? That we know that locking people up in the US doesn't actually solve anything. And even when you're convicted, it doesn't mean one of my dear friends, Lisa Swanin, who is another public survivor, their father raised them, got raised in childhood, and got some brief period of probation, and then went on for abuse, right? And so this is, and that's when people are convicted, like that's what we do. So let's, think about the abject failure that the criminal legal system is. And to my mind, this is one of the things that, actually, I think that many of us know this in the core of our being. Survivors don't report. The vast majority of particularly child sexual abuse survivors are most likely to tell us fear. And then they keep their mouth shut. And we want to do something about it. That was my experience as one of my best friends sexual abuse. And they, right? And even then I could only tell my sister when I was 15 years old, absolutely thinking he was going to die within a few weeks. That's when it was finally safe, because I didn't want others to harm myself. I didn't want my father locked up. I didn't want to be taken away from, I didn't want to be taken away from my family. I didn't want child abuse to be from my family. I didn't want possible deportation of my brother and my sister away from me. This is what fixing it for me was like, right? I lived in an all-white town in rural South Central Pennsylvania. Anyone paying attention to the news knows the middle of the state of Pennsylvania is maybe not the most welcoming place for immigrants, this place. And so the children that I knew who went into these foster homes were, it was all very, very evangelical Christian families, not practicing my religion, not going to honor my vegetarianism, and surely not going to be like a place for me to relax. And so for these reasons, actually, this is what ensured my silence. Right? And as I grew older, I realized, it's not really mass criminalization in the US is not actually solving the problem. Even though, of course, I felt a lot of rage and sometimes hatred, and I even wished for my father to die at times. I never wanted to see him in a cage. And in the US, 2.2 million human beings are in cages. I know that maybe, when you think about it in comparison to our population there, right? And it's disproportionately people of color, immigrants. And so day after day, year after year, they languish there. If the criminal legal system, as it exists in the US, actually kept survivors safe, I might have to hold my nose and make peace with it. If I knew that this system was actually reducing abuse, I would say, or violence, or these kinds of problems, I might have this question in my mind. Okay, we know hurt people hurt people. If you work with those who cause harm, you'll see in their own childhood there was so much rape, abuse, murder, everything that they are experiencing. I know this both from my work in victim advocacy and in my work as a criminal defense lawyer, as a public defender. definitely every person who I used to work in death penalty cases, and every client's case I was ever involved in, who was on death row in US, every one of them has a childhood that made my childhood look easy, okay? So we know harm begets harm begets harm begets harm. And so if you told me, okay, this system will just stop the harm by stopping all the people somehow, we could really catch everybody and put them in the system, then maybe we'd have some shanti for a few, decades, and then there would be less harm, and then the next generation would grow up with, overall it would reduce harm. But this has not proven itself to be true. First of all, we don't catch everybody. Over 40% of the murders in Los Angeles, nobody even gets caught, and so no one's even arrested, right? So this is very telling. We know a lot from this information. In addition, I remember the first day of law school, and I had criminal law class, which I really loved. I was really moved by the whole theory of how are we thinking about punishment. But I didn't like the Socratic method. And they would make you, the professor back in the day used to call on students. And the first day of class, I get called on in criminal law. And I was supposed to have done my reading, which I did. And I took all my notes in the margins. And Professor David Rudolphy, who was my professor at that time, he asks me, Sujatha, why do we punish? So my mind goes, first of all, I'm terrified. I'm sitting in this big auditorium of all these students. I've not met any of them, and I'm like the third person being called on in this whole 3-year endeavor we're going through in law school. And my mind went racing, and I was thinking of all these like college seminar class answers, like we punish because people's bad behavior is a mirror for our own, and we have to, we hate ourselves, and so we have to hate somebody else. This is not the answer that the law professor wants, right? There was an answer in the textbook. I'm thinking, because we don't know any better, that's why we punish people. We lack creativity and imagination. This is a law professor. There was an answer. It's a 4-part answer. And I got myself together, and I looked at my case notes, and I answered. General and specific deterrence, incapacitation, rehabilitation, and retribution. These are the 4 reasons why we punish in Western legal notion. So, okay, general and specific deterrence. General deterrence means when you see somebody else doing something terrible and they go to prison, then you're like, oh, I shouldn't do that because I'll be like them and I'll go to prison. Okay, the other specific deterrence is I myself don't want to get, this police officer is following me, let me not speed so that I myself, the law deters me from speeding. Okay, so I'm not gonna ask for a show of hands, but I'm just asking you to contemplate. When is the last time you broke a rule or a law? When is the last time you saw somebody get busted for some rule or law that they broke? And were general or specific deterrents actually ever an indicator? Do you speed? Have you ever gone above the speed limit? I mean, I could go on a list, and sometimes when I'm in a smaller group that's not online and less public, I ask people to like investigate. Have you ever made a little modification in your tax return? Have you ever, right? I mean, we're all breaking the law all the time. And there are many, many advanced studies that show neither general nor specific deterrents are actually deterrents. That is not why we don't break laws. We don't break laws because we don't need to. We're privileged enough to not need to make the change on the tax form or whatever. We break laws because we think we can get away with it even though there is a law, right? Or that we do a little cost-benefit analysis and we take the risk for risky people. I myself have been known to speed from time to time. And, or we don't break laws because our conscience tells us not to, not the law, or that we've been given the tools of emotional self-regulation, or there's so many other reasons. The general and specific deterrents have literally been shown to have 0 impact. Okay, so that's reason number 1 for punishment. been proven to be useless. Reason number 2 is incapacitation. I used to think, oh, this makes sense. If you take them away from us, they can't hurt us. Except it ignores the fact, 2 facts. Number 1, who is inside prison? Other human beings. So are you incapacitating anyone from harming other human beings by putting them in a prison? No, you're just deciding that this group of human beings don't matter to us. We don't care if there's a prison riot. We don't care if people are stabbing themselves. We don't care about the astronomical rate of sexual violence inside both men's and women's detention facilities, here in the US, everywhere, right? We don't care. We're saying those people don't matter. And then we forget so many people are under trials, we don't even, we've decided if they're sitting in there, they must have done something, right? So we're not really incapacitating people by putting them on some island together. Okay, so that's, and then the second reason incapacitation doesn't work is that in the US, at least, most sentences are actually quite short. We're literally sending people away for some brief period of time, only to return with better skills for how to do harm. And as we know, most things, like my friend Amita's father, didn't even get time, right? Didn't even go away, actually. So who are we incapacitating? So then the third reason is rehabilitation. I meant to look up Indian statistics on it. Most countries don't keep really accurate rehabilitation statistics about what is the length of the sentence, does it improve the chances of somebody not committing future offenses. Our experience in the US is that most sentences are short and actually increase the rate of recidivism. So, this word that criminologists use, criminogenic, what things cause people to cause future crimes. And I say, what's really criminogenic? Criminalization is criminogenic. It's like, let me develop a tool for safety that is more likely to cause harm to the people it's trying to protect. No tool like this would exist in the public market, right? If you had some booby trap safety device that's supposed to shoot intruders, but instead it's more likely to shoot the people who live there. Stop it in their home. Nobody, but that's what incarceration is doing. And even criminalization, right? Because we take away people's capacity to have future jobs in the US. All of these limitations on one's life exacerbates the very roots of the thing that caused the behavior in the first place. Okay, so that leaves the fourth reason, retribution. That there's an independent good for having a punitive response. That when someone does something terrible, we have to do something terrible to them, right? But we know Gandhiji's quote, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. I try not to use that as much because I work a lot with folks who are deaf and blind in the US, and they're like, that's kind of an ableist thing, but because there's so many other ways to see, so I want to honor that. And at the same time, there's something very powerful in that statement, right? We are, I like what Fania Davis says about why do we kill people? To show people that killing people is wrong, about our death penalty. So, restorative justice really called my heart because it was showing a way, that fourth reason it is effective. Like, it's doing what it sets out to do. I'm not saying retribution is effective, but of the 4 stated goals of punishment in this legal systems the world over, the only one it's actually achieving is the 4th. Okay, your system is effective at being retributive. That is what it intends to do in its punishment, and it does. Whether or not that's actually moving any of us forward in a good way in the world is to be determined. In my experience in restorative justice, it is not. So what is restorative justice? There are so many definitions, and there's a lot of confusion, and a part of my work in the world is around helping people understand what it is and what it isn't. And you can agree with me or disagree with me, and that's totally fine. I tend to be a real student of Howard Zare, who's the one who did the first writing and thinking on this theoretically and also in practice. But over the years, the term has broadened to mean all things to all people. And I personally think that that's caused a lot of confusion in the field. And so I'm going to be specific I'm going to end up leading us to a place that's very specific about the definition of restorative justice and what practices exist within restorative justice that I feel are aligned with restorative justice values, principles, and theories. And to me, it is fundamentally a paradigm shift in the way in which we think about harm and wrongdoing, right? And so what do I mean by paradigm shift? In the way that, Thomas Kuhn in his Structures of Scientific Revolution talked about that 200-year period of time in which there was, real debate, and that sometimes at risk to scientists' heads, to say that it's actually that the Earth revolves around the sun, not that the sun revolves around the Earth, right? And I would say that we are living in a world in which we think that the sun revolves around the Earth, and that we're that flawed in our thinking about punitiveness, punishment, retribution, being the way that we will make ourselves a healthier, happier, safer, more whole world. And so this is the paradigm shift that Howard Zare calls us to. And so what is, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but I also just need to start with less, maybe in Western thinking, precise definitions. So this is Robert Yazzie, one of my teachers, and he wrote a brilliant article that I would encourage everyone to read. It's available all kinds of places online, called Life Comes From It. And he's talking about Navajo justice, and it's completely parallel to thinking in restorative justice. So check that out. And he says, what is justice? Life comes from it. Okay, that's very vague for most of us, but as you read his article, you'll get more of a sense of what he means. Other things he says is, you know that you've achieved it when you're moving forward in a good way. You know you've achieved it when you're moving forward in a good way. And another thing, and it's about change and about movement for all of us in the natural flow of things that brings us back to a good state, which in Navajo Diné languages is called Hojo. And he really encourages us to know in our souls, like, when are we moving towards this state of beauty and balance and well-being in our communities, even after the worst things have happened. This possibility of change exists in so much indigenous thinking. I credit in part to the very languages that they speak. So there's a commonality amongst most, in North America, indigenous languages, that these languages mostly don't have don't have nouns. And so I want you to think about this for a second. A language without any nouns, how does that work? So Anishinaabe language, there's a book, another book I would really encourage people to read called Braiding Sweetgrass. Braiding Sweetgrass is a book by a botanist, an indigenous woman in botanist named Robin Wall Kimmerer. And she explains that in her language, there are no nouns, and instead, so if you talk about like the Bay Area where I live, right, there's a bay. And so for me, that's a noun. It's a bay. It's the bay. I walk to the bay. I look at the bay. And she says that's really offensive. You're really objectifying that bay and leaving it fixed in time. She says in our language, you would call that wikwegama. Wikwegama is to be a bay. Because obviously it will be mist and it will be rain and it will be a river and it will go to the ocean and it's not stuck as a bay. There's no such thing, a bay. The bay itself will be gone. The bay will become a mountain, and you're so stuck in things being nouns, right? And Justice Yazzie taught me in Diné, Navajo, there is no word offender. The word that they use to describe the same thing that we think of as offender in our fixed way is acting as if you have no relation. Acting as if you have no relation. So, and he means this in the sense of all my relations, ultimate interdependence, that the trees are my relations, and the flowers are my relations, the sky is my relations, and the rabbit is of course my father is my relation. My Anu, if he was acting as if he has no relation, on a very basic level, I first went back to Justice Yazzie and I said, I've been thinking about this relationship to the incest I endured with Anu. And if he had thought of me as his family, then he wouldn't have done this to his own daughter. And he's like, God, you're so become so American in your thinking, so individualistic. Okay, yeah, that's nice that you had that realization. You know, I said, no, it's bigger than that. Like if Anu had been at home with his own family, his brothers, and so everybody would have said, you don't look at your daughter that way. You know, like come for puja, go get the champa flowers for the altar and let's sing bhajans together and let's be. You know, there would have been more eyes on the situation. This is when there was a period of time where we weren't coming and going so much, and I'd idealized India because whenever we came to India, Anu never touched me. Never once when I was in India. India was my safe place. You know, I was devastated to find out about the existence of all your amazing organizations. And I was like, no, really? This is so naive. This is happening in my perfect India. But, I mean, and just as Gabby was saying, you have to go even broader than that. You have to see your fathers as part of the totality of the flow of life. And we do good and we do bad. You know, wind is beautiful and it's the wind, whether it's making a hurricane or giving you a cooling breeze, you know, when you're feeling overheated in the sun. It's the wind, and you have to embrace the whole wind. This is a tall order, but I'm working on it. And he says, it doesn't mean that there's not justice. It doesn't mean we don't have to repair. We want to get to that state of bourgeois. We want to be in balance. Your father's acting as if he's out of whack with this basic reality, right? That we are all relations. More than just you are his butt. It's more than some incest taboo. It's more than being grossed out that a father would think about his daughter that way. So this is his big teaching for me, and obviously defies a tidy definition of restorative justice. So then the more Western side of my thinking needs that, the lawyer side of my thinking needs that. And so this is why these two teachers are so good for me. The other is Howard Zitter. And so, and these are two people whose feet I touch. This sweet Christian Mennonite man lets me bend down and touch his feet. I see him. And so this is his definition of restorative justice. He says, it's an approach to justice that involves, to the extent possible, all those who have a stake in a harm or offense in order to identify and address harm, need, and obligation in order to put things as right as possible. So I revisit this definition all the time because I think within it, there are countless teachings. The primary one that most people who work in the field of restorative justice think about are these words: harms, needs, and obligations. Who is harmed? What do they need? Whose obligation is it to repair it? This is how we think about it. But there's so many other gifts inside here. For me, who all has a stake in a situation? How broadly do we think about it? If we think about it just as Yazzie way, we're like the trees and the earth and the everything, right? But it helps us widen who we bring into restorative processes if we're thinking about it. Then also putting things as right as possible. Sometimes I do this work in murder cases where I'm bringing the parents of a murdered girl together with the boyfriend that's sitting in a jail cell in order to have a dialogue. How is it going to be put right? She's gone. She's never coming back, right? So how do we put things as right as possible? This is a gift, I think, these last words. So yeah, this is the fact that the word possibility, as right as possible, the extent to which it's possible, it both is a freedom for us to give ourselves some grace in the process. And it's also, for me, I just love the word possibility. Like, it's not just the negative side of maybe it's not possible, so we'll do fewer people. It's actually, to the extent that it's possible, can be quite expansive, right? And so I'd encourage people to be gentle with ourselves when things feel impossible, and also be expansive with the notion of what is possible for justice for us all. So that's Howard. You can find his talks and readings and everything online. If you just spend some time immersing yourself in Howard's thinking, it's a gift. So this was the basic paradigm shift Howard calls us to, right? The current criminal legal system, if I'm training prosecutors, it's at a very basic level. If you got a file on your desk, what are you going to be looking for? What law is broken? Who broke it? How should they be punished? And this is our current system. Restorative justice is a completely different set of questions. Who is harmed? What do they need? And whose obligation is it to meet those needs? So if we got rid of that last question, it would just be the way we should all be with each other all the time. What happened? What do you need? I love you. Let me help, right? That third question makes it justice. Somebody is obligated to make it right. If you don't meet your obligations, you're operating out of whack with a notion of basic justice we should have amongst one another. So this, when you look at these questions side by side, we can say to whom and what do we attend? When I first heard about this, for decades I've been arguing that the victim advocates in the US are inside the prosecutor's office. And I've been saying it needs to be a third rail. And then when I found out about CSJ, I was like that. People need lawyers who are representing their interest in court, not the state's interest. The state's interest is in incarceration. And when I was trained as a victim advocate, there were times when I felt prosecutors pressuring me to keep a victim as broken and angry as possible because she'd be a better witness on the stand against her abuser. What is her interest? Did anybody ask her, how are you harmed and what do you need? If somebody had asked me that when I was a child, I would have said I wanted to stop. I wouldn't have said put my father in a cage. Right? I want to find out what happened to him that he's doing this to us. Right? I had completely different needs. I want my family to not think that I was a sexy 6-year-old who seduced my father. I want them to make a circle for the women to get us to stop throwing each other under the bus, as we say in the U.S. Right? I had a lot of needs. None of them with my father. Right? So to whom is a set of questions? If we had any notion of justice, we'd be thinking justice for whom? Justice for the person harmed. Now, I'm not saying there are no survivors of any kind of harm who don't legitimately ask for a punitive response to the person. And for them, I say, okay, I'm not necessarily the person to work with you, but let me put you in the hands of a really good victim advocate at the district attorney's office. Okay, that's the path for you. There's no judgment from my side. That's what you need. What I want people to know, though, is that the chances of them getting what they want is extremely slim over there. I hope that someone is being honest with them about whether or not they find even the technical outcome of the consent, let alone this ultimate feeling of, because the study showed that even people who have spent 20, 30 years fighting for the execution of their loved one's murder feel no relief after the execution. If anything, sometimes it makes it worse. So what would it mean for us to sit with the second set of questions? That is what restorative justice is calling us to do. The big picture, according to Howard, is that restorative justice is a violation of people and interpersonal relationships, not the law. Right? The law may be there, not there, whatever. But this is what crime and harm are. Those violations create obligations, and the central obligation is to do right by the people you've harmed. So what's the work of it look like? As facilitators of restorative processes, we are widening our hearts to hold with not neutrality that sometimes we're trained in law school to be neutral mediators or neutral judges, neutral, right? I instead am equally partial. I am deeply invested in the success of the person who's experienced the harm and deeply invested in the success of the person who's caused the harm. Success in their making things right, success in changing their life so they never do this again. I fall in love, equally in love with everybody, and I bring in both of their communities to serve as the base of the work that we do together, believing in the capacity of family and community to help make things right. So what's it look like in action? I like this picture of President Obama sitting in a circle. I have another one of the Dalai Lama too. I don't know where I put that one, where he's sitting in a circle in Vancouver. And this one is the president sitting with a group of young men in Chicago. And the work of a facilitator in particular is what President Obama is doing here. Really deep listening. It really works primarily to listening to the answers to those questions. Who was harmed? What do they need? Whose obligation? A lot of deep listening. And, you know, sometimes there's an object called a talking piece or a talking stick, depending on if you've learned from indigenous people, or sometimes you just learn how to regulate conversation and go around in a circle. And there's no table in the middle blocking us from seeing each other's whole bodies. So sometimes it's a very simple question like, what happened? And everybody shares and shares for like an hour. And then you start to notice people moving towards solutions, and then everybody has to eat, because we have this word in, maybe you have it here too, hangry. Does anybody use hangry? Yeah, yeah. So hangry people cannot come to resolution. You have to feed everybody, which here you guys do all the time. There's like, I'm noticing the training schedule for next time, like, oh, there's chai, and then there's chai again, and there's snacks, and there's lunch. In the US, we're so stingy with food. We just drag people through to lunch, and then we drag them through to dinner, and there's no breaks, but nobody's listening or absorbing, and the same is true for restorative process. There has to be food, there has to be, you know, there has to be breaks, there has to be mingling. And so we start to move from, okay, what happened, and we get it all out, then we move into, okay, what needs to happen now? And that's sort of like more basic conflicts, you know? And if we did that every day with everything, what's happened, what needs to happen, even if it's not a conflict, we would have so much less harm and violence. If we made that a practice of that deep listening, what's happened? Let's co-create an answer. It's a very, very oversimplified answer. There's a lot of preparatory work, particularly of the person who experienced the harm. And just a note on language. So you hear, I try to avoid these. I'm not moved into creating my own verb-based language, but I do try to not label victim, offender like this. Because I don't want to be stuck in that box. I don't want to be a victim. Sometimes I've been an offender. I don't want to be the offender, right? I once gave a talk to the Coalition for the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers. And my talk was started with, why do you call people the thing you want them to stop doing? Right? Like, let's move past this. So we do preparatory work with the person who's experienced the harm and the person who's caused the harm, really preparing them for understanding what are their needs, what do they want to see happen, and the person who's caused the harm to prepare them with apologies and accountability, and who's going to support them to be accountable, who's going to love them unconditionally so that they can have a community to support them as they work through this problem. And so then we do the prep, and then we ultimately, you know, find supporters on both sides. We bring everybody together. Everyone knows what's going to happen. Lots of feeling of safety comes from having knowledge about what the process looks like. Right? So we've informed everybody we're meeting at this time. These people will come first. We don't have to bump into each other on the way in. Like a lot of logistical stuff that creates the container of safety. But when you get in, it's a circle, right? It's not two sides in a court looking to a judge for the answer. It's we have come here together to co-produce the answer. We talk about the problem, we start talking about the solution, and then we come up with a plan to repair the harm that generally has 4 parts. First and foremost, doing right by the person who's experienced the harm. Then it's doing right by the person who's the parents of the child who's caused the harm if they're in that relationship. And then doing right by the community, and then doing right by yourself as the person who's caused the harm. How do you need your life to change in order to not do this again? And then there's a whole column in this chart that we're filling out of who's going to help this young person make it right. Who's the community is going to make sure that this happens? What resources are needed in order for this to happen, right? So that's basically what it looks like in action. And so we've done some studies in the US, both randomized control trials as well as very comparative match samples. I think there's like 14 sites running from the original one that I started in major cities across the United States. Primarily, these cases come from the elected prosecutor who has created a system for diverting cases without charging the child. So the child is not formally entered into the system. The child has been caught, but not entered the system. And the youth who come into our process have a 44% less likelihood of reoffending. And so I asked us to measure recidivism, reoffense, by conviction instead of by arrest. Because in the US, we have this big problem of just arresting all the children of color for just existing. not even curfew violations, whatever. You're walking down the street as a kid of color and the cop can say, you fit the description of somebody who's been, and then they pull you over and they look through your backpack and then they find marijuana and, then or they find nothing, but then you're late to school. One kid I know got stopped by 2 different police officers on the way to school, and his uncle had just died and his mother was out of work, and so he missed a lot of school helping with something, and with the things at home that needed attended to. Twice by 2 different police officers, he fit the description of somebody who's just carjacked somebody or something, and then proceeds to be late to school a final time, in which point he's expelled from the school or suspended. Now he's caught in the truancy court, and then he's gone down the road of his own criminalization. But just because ultimately the straw that broke the camel's back on his life was police stopping him for fitting the description of somebody else, who'd committed some crime. So that's why I say arrest should not be the indicator of reoffense, but rather full conviction. That being said, even if you measure it by subsequent arrest, it's 33% reduced. Something about engaging in these processes where people are all keeping an eye on this young person in a loving way helps reduce the amount of reoffense or rearrest even. So satisfaction of the person harmed has hovered around 91% in all the studies that we've done, regardless of jurisdiction, and these crimes are serious, they're all felony offenses and high level misdemeanors. And we've measured satisfaction by a number of different results. Unfortunate question. If this ever happened to you again, would you prefer this or court? And so if this happened to your friend, would you suggest it over court? Like, so all these numbers kind of come up around the 90% rate. And forget what's happening next. Cost savings, obviously, there. I mean, incarcerating a youth in America is like astronomically expensive. Depending on the size of the facility, it can be $200,000 a year, it can be $400,000 a year. I mean, to give a kid 5 Harvard educations for that much money, right? And this is what we spend our money on. But even these don't feel like, there's so many people who didn't want me to start doing the math on restorative justice. I felt it was necessary to be able to get us funding. The funders all want proof of concept and, and I was like, especially my indigenous teachers were like, this is disgusting. They want you to like measure it, it's just the right thing to do. Why are we having this conversation? But I have found that people who then start keeping track of their data do find that there's more amenability among some of the more conservatively minded people. That being said, I have literally had a district attorney who I was trying to make inroads in his jurisdiction tell me that it was my data that told him that he would not engage in our program because he doesn't want to put himself out of business. He has a staff that needs jobs. Locking children in cages, even though he knows that my thing would make the public safety would be increased. So just needed to name that reality. So, okay, that's the bad news. Missed all my notes, but that's okay, let's keep going. Well, there's one other thing that I didn't put on this slide that I think is really interesting. The highest levels of success actually came from the parents of the children. My child is talking to me more. Both the victim, and especially in sexual violence cases, the family's like, oh, my daughter tells me everything now. Oh, we have better relations. She's not off in her room on her phone all the time now. She's actually staying a little after dinner. And the child who caused her harm, oh, he's actually going to school more. We saw a 68% increase in school attendance for children who, it wasn't even something we put in the plan, but the child starts going to school, or the child is following our internal family curfew. He was supposed to be in by, 11 on a school night and 1 a.m. on weekends, and now he's doing it. He's coming home on time. So these kinds of changes that happen from just being able to tell your parents what's really going on in your life and having it all come out in the open really increases the child-parent relationship, the positivity of that. Okay, I apologize for the crooked slide. I leave it that way because when my kid was in middle school, he's 19 now, I asked him to photocopy some of these things for me to use, and he did it wrong, and I kept trying to make him redo it, and it just kept being crooked. And I had a memory of my own giving up the violin, and because my mother, there's this word in Konkani, apasur, which means like slightly off. And I feel like my whole life is so slightly off. My speech are never right. Although thank you, Sangeeta, for dressing me nicely today. I can't put myself properly. No, sorry. I'm always something's like slightly off, and it made me feel bad about myself growing up. I was always trying to be perfect to make up for the incest, which nobody knew was happening. And so this crooked slide makes me happy because did you guys fix it? I don't have my glasses on. No, it's still a little crooked. So because he kept trying, and I saw him getting frustrated. And I didn't tell him it was perfect, but the fourth time he handed it to me, I looked at him, I saw his frustration, and I said, "You are perfect, baby. You're perfect." So the crooked slide makes me happy, and something that we need to, don't make our kids quit violin because something's always slightly off pitch. So okay, so what is this? This is Howard Zier's Continuum of Restorative Justice Practice. And these are 6 questions. I'm just going to, the folks online can see the slides, right? I'm going to save my voice and just let you read these to yourself. Can you see them in the back, actually? Yeah? Okay, then I'll let you just look at these. So when I first got involved in restorative justice, I noticed a few flaws in the movement in the United States that started growing in the 80s. And one is that it wasn't available to use of color. It seemed to be only something happening in the Midwest for white kids who had like jaywalked or something, or done some graffiti. And I was like, well, what about kids in Oakland who actually carjacked somebody with a gun? Like, can we bring this here, right? And I came with a critical mind, about reforms only happening for white kids. And I came with a critical mind about, oh, you're sitting in circles in prisons, but how is that actually ending mass incarceration? What about doing it pre-charge as a way, as an alternative to locking people in? And I became very sort of correct about it. And my friend John Kidda, one of my best friends, is really a wonderful friend and teacher in the field, used to kind of nudge me about trying to open my mind, although you kind of come to this part of the work as a lawyer, Sujatha, like there's a statute and people are violating the point 3, section 2, whatever. So can you broaden your thinking a little bit? And my then boss used to joke, he says, this is Sujatha, when I was doing my lots of public education. He says, this is Sujatha, she runs our That's Not Restorative Justice project. And John reminded me, my friend John reminded me of Howard's continuum of restorative practice, from fully restorative to pseudo or non-restorative. And so really I should reserve these words, that's not restorative justice, for the things all the way on the pseudo non-restorative end. And there are many things that sit in the middle, okay? And these 6 questions really help us engage in them. I'm only going to talk about the first one, and that's because it changes the language a little bit. Does the model address harms, needs, and causes? Not just obligations, but also what's at the root? And I really love what Sonia Shah says, not just stopping at, oh, this kid's doing this because, and then the first answer. What is the cause of the cause of the cause of the cause? How do we get there, right? Spending a little time in the circle, really deepening that in the preparatory circles of the family, and then ultimately. So we want to spend some time with this. And, what John said is, Sujatha, when you're meeting with people who you feel really disappointed with the way in which they're doing things, it doesn't feel aligned, or it feels like it's using the words restorative justice to actually double down on punitiveness. And I will say that is the case with some youth courts, for example. You replace the jury with a bunch of other kids, and you encourage them to be as punitive as possible against, it's like these model youth courts, and the kids get to practice being like this. And I go to jurisdiction, I say, okay, your district attorney wants to start this just restorative justice diversion program. And they say, we already do restorative justice, we have youth courts. And I go watch the youth court. Youth court is worse than regular court. Like, it's more punitive. And it's actually also teaching a bad civics lesson. In the U.S., the jury only determines guilt or innocence, except in death penalty cases, where the jury also decides life or death. In youth court, the guilt has already been determined, and the jury is coming up with a sentence for the child, and they're brutal sentences. Like, these peers sit in judgment, they're encouraged to judge. It's like, so for me, that sits on the non-restorative. I don't even think you can add the word restorative to these youth court models. Maybe to the degree to which one of the things they sentence you to is trying to find out how to fix it with the person that you harmed, right? But even that just feels totally off to me. But John is encouraging me to use these different words. That's not quite restorative yet. What can we do to answer some of these questions or change the practices that we're doing to move it from the non-restorative to the fully restorative end? I myself have a definition of the fully restorative end that I'm working on, which I should put on a slide, but I don't. Because I'm still playing with it. But it's around face-to-face dialogue and participatory decision-making, in which those who've caused harm are lovingly held, directly accountable by their community and loved ones to their survivor's self-identified needs, right? To the needs of the person who's experienced the harm, self-identified needs. So that's too wordy, and I have to find a better way to say all of it. But that to me is the fully restorative. You've created a situation in which the person who's experienced harm feels safe enough to meet with the person who's caused the harm. You've got all the right supporters. They're defining their own harm. Family and community are lovingly holding the person who caused the harm accountable. You need to have the word causes and gets at root causes, and then get the definition getting longer and longer. But anyway, someday maybe if I broke it into bullet points like this, it would be more helpful. Okay, so that's how it's continuing. And so what are the practices? So to me, there's two other things that sort of, there are two big questions that push us towards place us somewhere on here. And there's no right or wrong answer about these things, but there's implications about these things. So what are these models, and how restorative are they as models in and of themselves? And then where do they sit in relationship to the system, and how does that erode or buttress their amenability to restorative justice? So I will go a little bit more quickly through this because I'm realizing it's been an hour, and I want to leave lots of time and space for Q&A and discussion. So these are some of the models that I have studied and learned from family group conferencing, New Zealand style, Aotearoa, is a process by which youth, primarily youth, but also some adults who caused harm, are brought into a dialogue. It's not a full circle process, but there's an order of speaking and a set of processes that result in the young person being held responsible by the person, by their family and community to the person's needs that they harm. Victim-offender dialogue, primarily in crimes of severe violence, usually happens inside prisons. It can happen anywhere, but it's often a dyad situation where, like, somebody's incarcerated and somebody else, the person who they've harmed gets to sit with them. I don't know if you can get these films in the US, but two brilliant films that discuss this model. One is called Meeting with a Killer. I'm sorry if you can get these films, yeah, outside the US, I don't know. Meeting with a Killer, and the other is Beyond Conviction. Beyond Conviction is the Pennsylvania model. It's my preferred model. But Meeting with a Killer is also just a brilliant film. It shows a woman and her grandchild meeting with one of the boys who killed the daughter. So the mother of the child, the grandchild, and the daughter of the mother have a dialogue. So you get to watch the whole process. It's very powerful. And then Beyond Conviction has 3 cases where you get to watch the dialogue. Circles can happen in schools, circles can happen in prisons, circles can happen in the community. I, for some time, held a circle for South Asian American women survivors of child sexual abuse. utterly unrelated to anything. Like the circles can be used for justice-related issues, not justice-related issues, but can be used for justice-related issues, right? And then peacemaking, indigenous peacemaking is not all circle, right? So it's not all passing and talking. Every indigenous community has their own way of doing justice. In the same way that family group conferencing isn't a circle, it may sit in a circle, but it's not the same order of practice that every community, every indigenous nation might do it differently. So these are 4 of the practices. There's so many more. Whether they're restorative or not, you can judge against those 6 questions. And then, I'm going to actually just breeze through this one as well, because I think I have to put my glasses on for. So, this is also a continuum from completely before there's any system contact until after any system contact is over, right? Circles can, so right now I'm working on a complex sexual harm case where all the victims are prison abolitionists, and 4 of them have been harmed by the same elder in their community, who, when I started working with him, had no idea that the sexual activity he had engaged in towards these 4 was non-consensual. And he himself, as an old man, woke up to the concept of consent by me working with the generation in the middle, some, 40, 50, 60-year-olds working with this guy and his older guy, who had harmed people in their 30s. Okay, and nobody wants to call the cops. Many of them are undocumented. Nobody wants any mess with this situation, and most of the people don't even believe in the system at all. Okay, so that is a case, a long, ongoing case. Sometimes I've worked in police diversion, and that is, what's the upside of that? Obviously, I've just explained, all these people have these obligations and these fears. The cautions are, what's really holding this person accountable? You have to have a strong community of this, in this case, men who are like, we love him and it's not okay that this happened, so I couldn't have done this case without those guys, right? So that's, caution, or it's like a need, maybe is even another way to think about it. Systems contact police diversion. This is where the police have, police can do whatever they want, really, when you think about it, right? And so sometimes they get cases, and instead of sending to the district attorney, they send to the nonprofit I've trained in restorative process. The upside of it is that it really minimizes youth contact with the system, and it increases the speed with which we can get the thing going, and the amenability of the child to engage, and the family to engage, being like, okay, it's just arrested, let's not go further down this road. The downside of it is that it requires police amenability, and also there's police corruption that happens even in the U.S. And whether that corruption looks like, we won't give this to black kids, only good kids, So there could be that racism, but even, places all over the world that drives everything, right? So that's a problem, or a caution that needs to be attended to. Thank you. A little warm, that time of life. Prosecutor diversion. So the child has been arrested and sent on to the district attorney, and the district attorneys I work with then choose a class of cases that they automatically refer to restorative justice without any engagement in the court system or criminalization. The upside of that is that, particularly when I work with these DAs, they make an agreement to send all cases that meet the criteria, which reduces racism in the discretion to divert. And the caution is that this only works if you get an agreement from the district attorney that nothing that's said in restorative processes can be used in a court of law. Otherwise, you're putting youth at risk for making confessions that then can be used against them. So I will not proceed in an official context without a promise, a written promise that then the defense community is aware of and can protect the child's rights against using restorative justice as an investigatory tool. I have to say it all the time. I am not your investigator, right? So this is really important, and I'm something that comes from my own past work with children who are in conflict with the law. Okay, you can use it as a process of determining a plea deal. So there's a case you can read about, an older case in the New York Times. The title of it is "Can Forgiveness Play a Role in Criminal Justice?" And it was a first-degree murder case that I worked on in Florida. And we used this restorative justice process, a hybrid between family group conferencing and a circle, to come up with the plea deal in this teen dating violence murder case. And so this dialogue that happened in that circle with the parents of the girl who was murdered, the parents of the boy who took her life, the district attorney, the public defender, everybody was there, and it was operating as legally as the pre-plea conference, which meant it was like a settlement negotiation for you lawyers out there. It means nothing, again, that happens in that process can be used later against him if the case were to fall apart in restorative justice and have to go to trial. So I have avoided judicial involvement entirely. I know people in the U.S. are doing it, but for me, once we get that far down the road, it is, in the U.S., it is quite difficult for it to truly be diversion or to be voluntary. Now, I'm open to discussions in every country. There's complications at every stage, right? But for me, this can be, this could be something to be explored, but you have to really take some of these other considerations I've been naming into consideration as a program like this were to get built. In prisons, we see it all the time, a bunch of men sitting in circles talking about the harms they've caused, going through an internal process of looking at who was harmed by their behavior, imagining what those people need. Sometimes we bring in surrogate victims. There's a facility, there are several facilities where I've gone inside, where I sit with a group of men who are serving time for sexually abusing children or for rape, and I will sit with them and talk to them about the impact generally, not in their specific case, right? Because I don't want to speak for any other survivor, but we're engaging with these questions of harms, needs, and obligations. And so there's a restorative element to these things. So that circles amongst the incarcerated, where we can have like the victim surrogacy dialogue. And then, as described, victim-offender dialogue can happen inside prisons. And then all of these things can happen if someone has gone through the whole system and then they're back on the outside, right? And you could do many of these things outside of the system. Or if the system breaks down, right? I had one case where a boy was going to be charged with an inappropriate sexual behavior to one of his classmates, and his family reached out to me saying, I know my son did this. He's not going through, the school's not doing anything, but I want my son to be raised in a better way. And the parents of the boy called me saying, can we try to facilitate a dialogue with the girl he harmed? So the system started and it failed, and then the parents, boy, they were like, we're really worried about our son, the way he talks about girls and da-da-da. So that was a really cool case. Okay, so with that, when you hear these cautions, you may think, oh, especially the lawyers, we're like, oh, we have to stick to the rules. We have to do it this way. We have to do it that way. It'll protect us. I have a couple points to say. Remember those first two slides about the failures of the system for child sexual abuse survivors? That data is just as bad for every crime. Right? So are we really serving people with our current system, or should we try something new? When I travel to places outside the U.S., oh, we don't need your American thing. You know, we're doing our own thing. Are you really? Because I kind of think your system looks a little British. I'm just saying. So is it really decolonized? Because if it were, then you'd be going back and looking at Panchayat. So you'd be looking like Ali Gohar used to talk about Jizga, updating Jizga. None of those systems were perfect. Obviously, they were steeped in patriarchy and all the things. Can we be creative about thinking about what existed here pre-colonization? And, you know, just a personal story, like briefly when I was like 13 or 14, I think, I left home. I went and stayed with a teacher, and I couldn't live at home anymore. And my mother thought Amma was like, she's the most difficult child. And also shaved half her head, dyed the other half blue, so much drama all the time, writing on her clothes, you know. She didn't know cutting myself with razor blades, like I was a mess. And I was really hurting, is a better way to say it. Eventually, the teacher, like, back in the day, a teacher could keep you, nobody had any questions, you know, now nobody would ever do this, because who knows, you know, the teacher could get accused of something. Teacher brought me home, and she put us at my dining room table, and it was almost like this impromptu circle. She said, so, why do we think Sujatha is running away? Why do you think Sujatha doesn't want to be at home? And Amma goes first, she's sitting next to me, and she's going on and on, her sister was perfect. She had all these problems. She's been so difficult. We don't know what to do with her. And I'm getting angry and angry. I'm sitting across from Anu. So teacher, Amma, me, Anu. So Amma goes first. Then it's my turn. And I literally was just, I don't know what happened, some strength came up in me, and all I said was, when she said, okay, your mother's finished, what do you think, Sujatha? Why do you think you don't want to be at home? And I looked Anu right in the eyes, and I said, I don't know, Anu, why don't you tell us why you think I don't want to? Who knows where that came from? Maybe it was my anger at listening to her, and something in me was like, it's not my fault. Plus, my blue hair looks really great. And I don't want to play the violin. Okay. So, and I saw for the first time in my life a little look of fear in his eyes. Tiny, and then he went on and on about, because he was my political hero. The school is racist and, this and that, and he blamed like the system and all things. He didn't take responsibility. He didn't say anything. All the other things that I love about him, having recognized how miserable I am, how hard it's been for me. And he listed all of these things, and didn't take responsibility. But from that day forward, he never touched me again. Never touched me again. And so that's, this is real restorative justice, what happened there. I never told anyone. When he came, he got very sick. A year later, he started having heart attacks and strokes, and then I was helping care for him. And, I had all this unresolved trauma from what he's done to me. And so when his mind was getting addled in some of his more lecherousness, nothing severe, but just it was uncomfortable to be in proximity with his body, having to wipe food from his mouth or put his foot back on the wheelchair or whatever. I was always like, oh, is my shirt showing? Like I couldn't be around him, So then only when it wasn't clear if he was going to ever come home again from the hospital, I told my sister. But in those 2 intervening years, it got better. I stopped cutting myself. I started to turn my life around. I had the courage to say, I don't want to play the violin. I want to be a singer instead. Like I started to embrace my power. And so, it's not a perfect story, but when people ask me like, who are you and why are you here? For me, that story is a really, really important one. So with that, before we move into Q&A, I would love for you all to take a little bit of time to turn to a neighbor, and maybe ideally someone you don't know, maybe move around a little bit, and do a little bit of discussion about what came up for you, just to take like 5 or so minutes, and make sure you give the other person some time to speak. The 5 to 7 minutes of we'll have a little pause, stretch, use Lou as needed, whatever, and just, and talk to somebody about what came up for you and what you heard. And really I am very strong and able to hear like, this is ridiculous and this would never work or these are the problems, but also try one little bit of like, I could see how this could improve X or Y or Z. I could imagine, what is possible with this in any community, your school, and your mandir, wherever it is. Like, how could this help? How could you lean into this a little bit? So let's take a little pause. And for folks online, if you want to throw some of those things into the chat, I don't know if it's being moderated, so be kind to one another. And really to speak from my statements and not in the chat in particular, to not debate each other. This is just idea generation, just idea generation. Okay, let's take a little pause. Yeah, let's say 10 minutes. It's the tea, coffee, and everything. Go get coffee. Oh, never. Don't do tea, coffee. That's at 12. Just Lou chatting 7-10 minutes. No, I'm good. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so I would love to hear if anyone wants to share. We have another mic. Yeah. Anything that came up during your discussion that you want to share? What I would ask is that the only request is if somebody else has something brilliant, they may not have wanted to share it. So just don't, let this dance between taking someone's idea, giving credit versus, you can talk about how something you've heard caused you to reflect, but don't say what I thought was really brilliant, so and so said, and then share their thing because it might be private to them. So does anybody want to share some thoughts that came up during the? There'll also be like question and answer time. If a question is coming up, that's fine too. But I'm not answering right now. I'm just wanting to hear more of what was coming up for you. Microphone, please.
Hi, I'm Susan Ulapalli here. Why I come here is that I've done this course on mediation, which is organized by the camp. So that's a beginner. But I have a few questions. I mean, not a few questions, but I would like to know how practical is restorative justice? When we talk about it now, my perception has changed on the offender as well as the victim. So what I could gather from the lecture that you gave us is that we have to work on the offender as well as on the victim for the final outcome for a positive outcome. But I would like to what is the practical aspect of it.
I'm going to actually ask somebody, does somebody have a pen? I'm going to just put some of these things down on, before answering anything, let's just hear some practicality. What's the practicality? What else are we hearing? What other thoughts have arisen as you're hearing this?
Hello, I'm Upneet. So in terms of introducing restorative justice, what I find in India, for us, it will be easier, because I deal with the corrections part, it's easier to have it introduced in the prison setup in certain manners. But it's always difficult for us to really hear the voices of victims of survivors of violence. We really don't hear them, and very few, I've known just very few cases of survivors spoken about their abuse and issues. And that one-to-one meeting or encounter is something that rarely takes place. So definitely, having the facilitation process within the setup is something that I would be really keen on working towards and understanding that part. And the way forward in terms of some of the issues that really need to be dealt with sensitively, since you're a lawyer also, so that part of it is something that's interesting to look at. Thanks.
What else? What other reflections? Please share.
Hi, I'm Siva from Enfold. So one thought which came to my mind and I wanted to clarify with you is how easy, is restorative justice, opting for justice this way, easier if the person who harmed or who is known to the person who experienced harm, and or if it's a stranger, it is easier to go for a punitive way of getting justice. What happens?
Great questions. We're loving these. Keep going. We'll discuss all of these things, so don't worry, it's not getting lost. I want to just Love to hear, just culling all the thoughts and questions.
Hi, Sujatha. Thank you for all that you do. So I've always been struggling with not the process, but how we define harm, how, in what context, and how harm also looks in the context of justice, because we also recognize that a lot of individuals have impunity and some certain acts, and one of them being sexual violence. So can we, while we articulate what are the possibilities with restorative process, can we also articulate what are the limitations?
I have another one in the back. Let's do that one, and then I'll start to reflect on this, and then we can move into like Q&A. Oh, good. Let's get a couple of those as well. Thanks. A few online we're going to hear from.
Hi, I'm Geetika.
Hi.
And I work in the mental health care space. Also, the conversation that we were having was also around children and how we were thinking about how does the restorative processes also then look like while working with children, while we do know that also the work in like when we do workshops or sessions in schools, which is for a limited time period. We're just looking at how can that support spaces and that time period for that support, how can that be extended? And like you said earlier about the possibilities, how can that be expansive in that sense? So then also from the work that I do, kind of like play-based and nature-based work, we're also thinking around like how that and how to create spaces which have like possibilities sort of resources, which possibly can be kind of accessed post these conversations that happen in school with children also, and just how we can expand those resources post these workshops and how that access kind of stays with them to sort of their playgrounds and these classroom spaces as well.
Thank you all. A couple from online, so let's hear some voices from online.
Yeah, so one question is with respect to RJ circles or in any RJ medium, which can arise difficult emotions, processing the emotions or their after effects can be a challenge. This is especially if the case if one does not have access to mental health services or support systems. Do you see this as a challenge? And are there ways this is being taken care of in some manner? Any suggestions in this regard? That's one. Second is a reflection from Louise. Something that came up for me as a law student was some frustration and also curiosity about this perspective of justice resolution being so absent from my legal education, and then wondering about where this could be integrated more for students. Namrata has shared, what stood out for me is reaffirming the power of RJ and the role of deep listening. The example shared about the mother and daughter took me back to our work with survivors and families. I take back some ways in which we can foster better connection and resolution using the deep listening, prompting open-hearted space to both the parties. There are some specific questions related to the Indian legal framework, and how do you see this working out within India? What would be a way to make it mainstream? A specific question is, from Radha. I'm preoccupied with how a survivor will feel later on, post-mediated forgiveness. What if they want to undo it in times of great grief? Does it happen? If yes, how is it happening?
Great. These are beautiful. Okay, I'm going to do a really quick run through of some initial thoughts. It's so funny people call me restorative justice expert. I literally don't think there's such a thing. I think we're all experts. And then I say these things out loud and then I proceed to like give quote unquote answers. But I really don't know, like we're really building something new. And in every context I come into, there are new hurdles and new possibilities. And I myself cannot possibly see all of them. Even where I live, even where I am, I don't see all the humongous walks and the big openings and the big and small ones too. And so as I sort of run through some of my initial thoughts on these things, okay, listen to me. We can open up to more discussion and dialogue. These in reverse order, actually. So these survivors regret and post restorative justice dialogue, maybe even there's been forgiveness. There's like 7 things in that last comment that I'm going to try to run through quickly. So number 1, that title of that New York Times piece about my work, it was in the New York Times Magazine. The reporter called me the day it came out, and he said, "You're going to hate the title." The title is "Can Forgiveness Play a Role in Criminal Justice?" I spent half my time explaining that we should never pressure victims to forgive. Never pressure people who've experienced harm to forgive. Forgiveness may be an outcome. It is neither a prerequisite for participation, a potential forgiveness, nor should it be expected outcome. We don't know what's going to happen in the process. Maybe but forgiveness is owned entirely by the person who's experienced the harm. That is their right to relinquish their anger. Maybe something will, I always say, I can't imagine a better cauldron for cooking up some forgiveness than a good restorative justice process. Because some of the basic elements are there: acceptance of responsibility, doing things to make things right, and a full inventory of the harm. These things are necessary to let it go, right? But will it happen? None of our business. Don't feel like you failed the process, the victim didn't forgive, and da-da-da. Other things can come. Maybe they just got their purse returned, or maybe they just got aunties to hear that it was non-consensual, not that you were running around with that boy, or whatever, right? That could be enough, and that's wonderful. So forgiveness should never be pushed. That being said, so the question is, after, would there be regret? Later you realize. I've even said about my own forgiveness of my unmoved. If I had I've forgiven my father. That's a whole other story that I was extremely lucky to get the personal guidance when I was 24 years old. I had an hour-long audience with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which is a whole other crazy story that I will tell someday. But there's talks online if you want to hear about it. But ultimately, I completely forgave my Anu for the abuse he had passed. So there was no ongoing abuse. I only had to inventory what had happened, and was I ready to stop being enraged? And how could I let that go? Because it was my rage was wrecking my own life. And so what I said is I gave myself this caveat as I became this public speaker about forgiveness. So I would say, if I had some recovered memory and I found out about some other abuse that he did to me that I hadn't remembered, I would give myself the right to unforgive. And one of the things I love the most about the Tibetan system of justice prior to Chinese occupation is they had no closure. In the US, when a case is closed, it's closed permanently. The outcome is finished. Civil, criminal, finished. You take your outcome and it's done. In Tibet, they're like, well, what if you found out something new? Nothing. What if you died and you're still angry? The point is to have healing and coming together and resolution. And if the resolution isn't there through the court case, you can open a case the day after it closes if it didn't work the way you wanted. Right? So there's some practical questions around that for American and probably Indian. You're already backlogged enough, like you don't need endless cases, right? But to me, restorative justice has to be the same way. And I have definitely had circles where something new came up, or the boy said he was going to tell everybody that it wasn't my fault, but then he kept talking to this other friend. We have a second circle, we have a third circle. So whatever you need to make it right. So lawyers. How do we help the law student who feels dejected by my talk? So what I'll first say is I am so glad I became a lawyer. That is the system that we currently have. And I am so grateful that I understand what it is, so that I can understand how to interface with it. And I had this epiphany. I went to drop out of law school 2 weeks in after that, and I didn't know who to talk to except that lovely criminal defense lawyer, David Rudofsky, who is my friend and mentor to this day. He's in his 80s. And I go back to Philadelphia, I always spend time with him. He stopped me from dropping out. I said, I came here to be a prosecutor. And then one day into your class, I realized, why do we punish? This is crazy. I don't want to do this. I couldn't tell him because I wasn't public about my survivor history. I was like, I just met the Dalai Lama and I've forgiven my father and I'm doing this meditation now. I don't believe in any of this and I have to drop out, but I'm going to be in debt. I already paid the tuition. And he said, and he talked me through, and he told me about this organization that defends women who kill their abusers. And I was like, oh, I'll be a defense lawyer. And then through that, I got involved in defense and whatever. And through all those years, and then I defended everybody. And I'm so grateful that I did, because I came in close contact with people. And there's a way you can infuse this heart into the work that you do. And so also there's those two sides. One is my friend Susan Marcus is a longtime restorative lawyer, and she infuses restorativeness into every case she helps litigate. In addition, lawyers are needed to help answer the whatever questions, how will this work with the Indian system? I can't tell you how many times police or prosecutors have said, because they don't know I'm a lawyer, there's assumptions, especially when I was younger, I looked quite young and I didn't dress like a lawyer. I was always wearing a kurti and jeans showing up at these places, and they're like some activists, you know? And they say, oh, we're sorry, honey, but we can't do that because the law prevents us from blah, blah, blah. And I'd be like, actually, in this statute, it says that DAs can divert, da, da, da. So like, we need lawyers because we know what you can and can't do in relationship to the system. So it is not an easy road to walk, law school students. I appreciate your struggle, but I was abjectly miserable for all 3 years I was in law school. And so I understand the situation, but I have no regrets in the long run, that this has been a tool that has been useful. I did have to unlearn some of that binary, us, them, right, wrong, the court setup. Thinking is the opposite of what we do in restorative justice, but you can hold two truths simultaneously. Okay, so processing the emotions and the after effects of restorative justice. I mean, I think that a really, really important thing, yeah, if there's access to mental health issues, these are not mutually exclusive things. I myself have been in therapy for most of my adult life. And I meditate, and I try to do yoga sometimes, and I go for walks in nature. And I have circles for survivors, South Asian survivors of child sex. Like, we might need as many things as we can possibly get. For me, if I'm working with someone who's really at risk for mental health issues, I make sure I partner with another organization that can help hold that space. So when I was doing that murder case where the boy was in jail, I was eliciting from him that he hadn't remembered from his own participatory trauma of how he killed her. He had blocked the whole thing out. And people like, he's lying. And I'm like, no, that's trauma. And I had to work closely with him to get him to remember how he killed her, because I knew the girl's parents were going to want to know. And then I was putting him at suicide risk. So then I had to work with the jail facility and make sure he was on suicide watch. And then I tried to get him counseling through the defense team to make sure that it wouldn't be discovered by the prosecution. Right? So you do have to, it's like the rest of the world still exists and all these gorgeous tools exist. You know, I'm so glad I have all the things I have to help me be who I am today. And the same is going to be the truth of all these other folks. Okay. Schools, time period, yes. You know, one of the things I find most moving is when teachers tell me, there's one math teacher who was really opposed to restorative justice coming to her school. She's like, I have to get through this curriculum in this amount of time, and there's no way I can if you add this circle stuff to my classes. And then by the end of the training and of her starting to implement it into the school, into her classroom, she said, in the beginning, I thought I didn't have time for restorative justice. And in the end, I realized I didn't have time not to. And what she meant by that was she would just put the kids in a circle at the beginning of class and say, give me 6 words about your weekend on Monday or whatever. No, 3 words about how you're doing today. She said, in the past, if I saw some child with crossed legs and kicking the other kid's chair, and I'd send them right out. And then there had to be an aide who would come, and the kid would resist me, and then the kid would get, and then I had to go to the principal. I didn't get to teach my subject matter, right? So when I started asking what happened this weekend, give me 6 words, give me 7 words. My uncle was shot on my porch. So now if the child is sitting there staring at the wall or kicking the next one's chair, you know why. It's not about you. It's not he's a bad kid. It's not he's being disrespectful. Number 2, she said when you give the children the chance to say the 6, 7 words, they don't kick the chair. Less likely to kick the chair, right? It doesn't solve all behavioral problems. So even in the context of a 45-minute class period, if you let people talk, like even just now, we have 2 hours together. After I'm done talking, I'm going to talk to each other. Every one of you isn't going to get to ask your question. And then this tension, or I have my question, these have got to talk to somebody. Right? I really help, like, bring it down. It helps bring the energy into a saner, calmer place. So doing a little bit of circle process in the confines of what you have, in the prison, is it full restorative justice? No. Do restoratively inspired things help? Yes, they absolutely do. So, yeah. How do we define harm in the context of people who have absolute impunity to do whatever they want? I don't know. I don't want to go back to America. I have a small problem with that, apparently. Okay, you keep, I got my OCI, so I can just stay, but my husband doesn't have any of my sons. Solve all that. But okay, so impunity. I really do struggle with, you know, I don't like diagnoses and whatever. I find from my defense work, I think we're too quick to label things as a borderline personality disorder or whatever, and then we write people off permanently saying they're incurable because they have a personality disorder. And I will say that there has been an incredible rise in mental health issues in the US and the world, really exacerbated by COVID, but people just behave totally badly often and with zero, it seems, moral compass, you know, no shame. And for me, my experience with those people that, you know, I've been working with people who've been labeled that way my whole life, and my experience has been, you know, to ask what happened to you that you did that, you know, where does this come from, you know? It actually works with a lot more people that we think of as having this instinct. If you're completely protected and you're a billionaire and you have all whatever, I think that is restorative justice going to fix everything in the whole world? No, you know. But it's going to do, in my mind and in my experience, it's doing a lot better than what we're doing right now. For me, when we say, tell me, it's like, tell me what happened, and then we'll use that against you to lock you up. We're not going to get people to get it, what they did and why. It's the opposite. You know, I love the Miranda rule, which is, it requires people to be read their rights when they're arrested in the US. I'm not trying to get rid of that. But the minute you say anything you say can and will be held against in a court of law, why do you say anything? And let people still confess. Why? Because we feel guilty. We do. Or we're trying to cover our butts or whatever. Everybody still talks. You can't shut up. The first thing you get in a prison and you tell your cellmate, don't tell anybody it was actually me. Then he's going to sell you down the river. It all happens every time, right? People talk. So most people, even the ones who seem like they're operating with impunity, fine. But for the Trump and Elon Musk of the world, I'm not really entirely sure what to do. For me, then I really fall back on this beautiful optimism that comes from, again, my teacher, Justice Yazzie. One time I was driving around Navajo Nation with him, and about 3 or 4 days into some of the most abjectly, I mean, it's like you think America is so, not you necessarily, most people know. It's not, in America, we have some story that we don't have what happens in other countries happening in our country. You spend some time in some Native American reservations and you see what is actually happening to indigenous people. Looks unlike, you know, just like many places I've been in all over the world. And I was really angry one day driving around with him being like, how are you not in a constant state of rage? And he just smiled. You're like, what would be the point of that? And I said, but no, seriously, how are you optimistic? You know, a horrific scenario of just the most abject poverty and impossible circumstances. And I was like, how are you optimistic, you know, about the plight of your people moving forward? Like how, and he said, I am really optimistic about what it's going to look like in 1,000 years. Kidding. And I realized, no, man, he says his people are really ancient. And there's a long view. And so it makes me think often of like, right now I'm really relying on this story, which I'm going to give away for the training because of the exercise we're maybe going to do around it if we have time, which is, oh, shoot, I'll finish it up. But basically you don't know how things are going to turn out. And so you just have to really keep optimistic because it's really, are you clairvoyant? Do you know? Do you know how this is going to turn out? We don't know. Okay. Easier if we know one another or not? Depends. Depends. My favorite answer for all things restorative justice is depends. Sometimes you know somebody, you hate them even more. Sometimes you know somebody and you think, oh, those poor people come from that community and I'm going to open my heart to them. I don't know. Sometimes you know somebody, you're like, oh, I know him and he's lovely, and why did he do this one thing? And your heart opens, right? It really depends. I've seen it go both ways, where it's more work to do or less work to do based on how these people know one another. But if they know one another, you really want to know the beef, the bad, we call it the beef, so it's a terrible expression in India, in general. Fraught, I know. Okay, so the backstory of the conflict. What is the backstory of the conflict? Or the relationship? You really want to know if they're going to work with people who know one another. Hearing the voices of survivors is really hard. I know but it's not just here. Really, I can't tell you when Me Too broke in US. Everyone knows I'm a public survivor, right? And there's so many people who are like posting on Facebook, Me Too, Me Too, Me Too, and then more than that, far more than that, my inbox. Thousands of survivors were saying, I really appreciate your post. I can't post, but I want to tell somebody. So, this is the nature of the shame that gets stuck to us, So this is for me culture change, right? Some of us get to stand up here. For God knows what reason, I never really cared. I mean, of course, I'm still impacted, right? Like there are parts of my family that are not particularly interested in me. The parts of my family that blames me. There are some Indian boys who did not want me to continue my work publicly if I wanted to marry them. And then there were some Indian boys whose parents didn't want this girl. That one's broken, put it back, pick a better one, like they're going to a toy store, right? There are impacts of being a public survivor. Let's be real, But I think that if we build a community of survivors where we stop giving up, fill in the blank, and really start to love one another and have a different notion of, I need a husband to survive, whatever all this. Is it really the worst thing in the entire world? For a long time I thought, if I don't marry an Indian boy, it's the worst thing in the entire world, And then these things eventually leave. But, but you need this, you need a community to help you when you're coming out of about this. Then practicality of restorative justice. So I don't know how to answer this question. Is it practical or not practical? I have found 17 elected prosecutors across the nation in the US who have agreed to divert cases from charge. I have helped start 2 or 3 organizations that are taking cases directly from the community. So it is occurring. Can it happen at scale? Again, I keep the 1,000-year view, because right now we prove that it works, and there are many of these DAs who are like, let's crush it, or let's co-opt it. I was 100% opposed to, particularly my nascent and new baby body of work around doing this with domestic violence. It has to be done a certain way. The last thing I wanted was for the federal government to get involved. They've written a $125 million grant into the Violence Against Women Act to be dispensed to the community to try restorative justice in domestic violence, with these certain caveats that I think actually are dangerous for the participants, and so is it practical? Is it not practical? I don't know. It's going to slowly happen the way it does. And I encourage people to experiment and imagine possibilities. So with that, I'm leaving some time for a couple more questions. If people have more to reflect or say, we have a little bit more time, 10 minutes or so, yeah? Okay. Something online, something in the room, yeah.
I'm True Prabhu. Can I sit down?
Either way, whatever makes you comfortable.
I deal with the young people. From my experience, the normal thing is young people defend themselves, what they have done, and justify or put the blame on the other person, and all this kind of game that's gone. In few cases, exceptional cases that I would like to bring it here, they felt what they've done is wrong. I'm not able to judge whether they really converted or repented for their wrongdoing, but they felt that they need to be punished. And they said whenever they go for counseling, yes, I will not do it, but they end up doing it. So only way that I can be punished to learn a lesson. How do you see those kind of things. They're taking on themselves that need to be forgiven. And secondly, I didn't go to moralize anything. My personal take, I didn't confront the person. I said, was there a lack of self-forgiveness which is leading to this kind of a conclusion? Or the wrong concept of guilt feeling. In India, through religion, we have put a lot of guilt feeling into the mind. So that is playing on him, which is, anyway, I'm going to be punished by God. So let me go through here on earth that punishment. That kind of a understanding that he is going through. Then I got transferred, I moved out and I couldn't follow. But we still keep in touch, but other things, casual friendship is carrying on. But I also felt that I couldn't address this real problem and those couple of cases.
Yeah, beautiful question. Thank you. Gorgeous question. So really appreciate this question. So I think that punishment is, that first answer that came to my mind when Professor Radofsky asked me, why do we punish? I said, because we lack creativity. And I think that's true when it's coming externally imposed, and I think that's true when it's coming internally imposed. This notion of punishment is the only thing. So yeah, counseling alone, getting into the root of why you did what you did, maybe it'll work for some people to stop. But you know, there's that, dealing with your internal issues, and then there's this notion of punishment, which is something being done to you to clear the slate, or to make an eye for an eye, or to resolve it. And then there's this other thing called accountability. And we don't think about this enough. What does it mean to be accountable, which is to repair the harm that you did? And when do we give people a chance to do that? So one of my favorite cases was a boy who stole someone's car, and it was a really important car, and there were important things inside it, and it was sentimental value, and the car was given to this woman by her dad, and they died the next week, and the car was so painful to her. And the thing that they ended up coming to an agreement about that he would do to make it right by her was to paint a 6-foot-tall Tinkerbell painting. And it is like the crowd, there's a video out there of me telling the story, and it's like, and she was made completely whole, and he felt that he gave something to her that she wanted, and he has no guilt. And he got involved in all these art programs, and he helped other kids who were involved in the system. So the option can be just work on yourself, or have somebody hammer you. Cleanse yourself of the guilt. You repaired the harm, and we don't have any opportunities for that in the way we currently see the world, right? So if you had a good situation, threw a ball through your neighbor's window and you broke the window, and your parent would take you by the ear and say, sorry, how much does it cost? We'll get you a job, you repair the window, or you work with somebody to repair it yourself. And then you can even see that window later and be like, I learned how to do windows and I ended up working in glass repair later in life. Like, it can be a happy story where you can cleanse yourself. But I do agree that we also, independently, this piece of lack of self-forgiveness. It's always so painful. My mother had no idea that the abuse was happening. And she cannot stop blaming herself for it. And really, as is with most incest situations, it's very stealth. There's no way to have known, right? And I don't blame her, but she just was for a long time constantly asking my forgiveness, right? So I think in those situations where you can't let go of the self-blame, that you really have to do an analysis of helping her come to terms with who was it? And did you have any capacity to know, right? And so that might take some additional work. But the Dalai Lama asked me when I was asking him for help about how to forgive, and he thought it was quite reasonable that I was angry, and I was such an angry child when I met him. And he asked me this question, do you feel you've been angry long enough? Are you really ready? You know, it's not, you don't have to answer, doesn't have to be yes. And I ask it to people about their lack of self, have you been punishing yourself long enough? How is this self-punishment serving you? How is it disserving you? I think that's a really good question to grapple with. I'm taking a lot of time answering this question. Please, go ahead.
Thanks. Hi. So this is to also have a long answer implication. I think a huge reason why, of course, the system is inherently punitive and it's colonial, etc. But I think a huge reason why especially a lot of women, a lot of survivors who are in the system, who are lawyers, activists, go back to it is because of the sheer frustration that you feel and anger that you feel at just running into it again and again. And you know, no offense meant, but like giving men so many chances, but these ways of thinking, and I mean, I hate saying patriarchy because it's so many things. These ways of thinking are so deeply embedded in the mind of men and boys that just I mean, you know, it feels like you will never actually get to the point where a boy or a man will feel accountable for the harm that they did. And then in frustration, you go back to fine, you deserve to be locked up. And I don't advocate that, but I understand it. So yeah, just a thought. And
thank you so much for that comment. I think we don't have a restorative justice system yet. And it may not be available where you live or da-da-da. And so the question becomes, should you try something on the side yourself or should you go with the system or not? I don't judge anybody. And like I said, like when people send survivors to me and in the process of saying how you harmed and what do you need and this is what we do and would you want this opportunity? No, I want him locked up. You know, I'm like, I felt that way. Not just locked up. At one point, I wanted to bring my father back from the dead so I could kill him myself. When I really started to think about the impact, the last, I was like, he's dead, now it's over. And then through my late teens and early 20s, I realized, oh, okay, I have a lifetime of trauma I have to unpack. And it's messing up my romantic life. It's messing up my ability to concentrate in school. I'm so angry. I wish he were alive so I could kill him myself. Right? What a natural response. I try not to judge anybody for whatever it is that they're choosing. The only thing that I worry about the most, and I try not to be like an ideologue about it, is to have the person who's going to engage in the criminal legal system have realistic expectations about whether or not they're going to be so super re-victimized by the system that they've actually put themselves in a worse place. Most of the people I know who've had to testify against their abusers feel like the cross-examination process and the whole staying in the case for so long that never gets resolved and then some garbage outcome actually made things worse for them. It's not just an ideological like punitiveness is bad and indigenous people are always right. And no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I was in court and I saw what happened. And so, you could be the best victim advocate, the best lawyer you could be in all the ways, and still you're dealing with the system is steeped in that same patriarchy, where the judge is going to say some totally horrific things, right? And so I just want us to be aware of what will happen, but no judgment. My God, like she's not restorative enough. That victim is a non-forgiving victim. Like, please, can we dispense? Like, none of us have walked in each other's shoes. Even if you're two incest survivors in the same community, what aunt has said something to me or what other experience I have that is my own healing journey, right? It's very different from everybody else. So thank you for that question. Online? Should we do one from online? Okay. Online in the room?
In your talk, you did mention about race being, and I feel here in Indian context, we need to talk about caste.
100%.
So when we do talk about the judicial system here, I mean the judicial system here, yes, it is very colonial, but so is the panchayat system as well. So we might have to look at it a lot more deeply, when we quote, because the access to justice, even in that space, is also deeply very casted. So we might have to, I don't know, when we have these conversations here, maybe talk about it a little bit.
A lot bit. Really, thank you so much for raising this. So in every country I go to, there's a different minority population, or it's not even, I don't like the word minority because sometimes it's like numbers is larger, right? Caste, religion. If you disaggregate your data on the basis of how many Muslim kids are locked up compared to the Muslim population, what are you going to see? How about gender non-conforming children? So all of this is really real everywhere we go around the world. There's a hierarchy. And the system is punishing people at the bottom of that hierarchy, whatever the hierarchy is. But caste is a huge problem, right? It is just it's a fundamental problem. And in addition, gender, you know, like, and it cuts both ways, you know, it's like, there are ways in which Black boys get punished, Black girls also totally get punished. So it's interesting to just look at how do these things play themselves out. How is it happening in the system? And then how are you replicating that same problem when you're building a youth diversion program? So for me, what I noticed is that 20% of, you know, there was I'm going to get the data wrong, but in Alameda County, there was double the number of white children being diverted in all diversion programs. This is before we started restorative justice. Then were kids of color. And then I went to the systems partners, the judges there. They're like, oh, it's because of the crimes they commit. But then I looked further, I was like, that's not true. Well, white kids commit the same crimes. You know, you look at this amount of cocaine that they're spreading amongst their friends, and they say because they're rich, they're like, oh, that was just for personal use. We're not going to charge them with distribution. But with Black kids, if they're still doing the same thing, splitting up the same amount of marijuana, you're going to charge them with intent to distribute, selling the drugs, right? So how are these things playing themselves out? And how do you build your youth diversion program to not replicate those same inequities? So the way we did this was to do a deep dive analysis of the data of who is being arrested for what crimes, and then look at those most at risk of being harmed by systems, impacted by systems, more systems contact, and create diversion programs that give the most opportunity from getting up out of that mess to the people who are most negatively impacted by the system. So what are Black kids getting arrested for? And let's create a diversion program for that. If you want to really reduce racial and ethnic disparities in the system, then you have to actively target improving the situation for those kids, right? And those kids have had the highest success rate of any diversion program. Honestly, I think kids without means and kids with excessive means are all a little bit like in the same bucket. Over here, it's like we have to steal because we're poor. And over here, everybody gets to steal because we're entitled to steal. And these are really hard cases to work on the end, you know? But this one, I admit my own bias, which I have to work on. My heart opens over here, you know, a little bit more. And that's why I spent my life looking over here. But once or twice, I've worked with super, super rich kids who got diverted just because the case was really severe. And I've gotten to fall in love with those children too. And really a real sadness. Like I've watched my dad do this his whole life. My dad's entire company runs on that, you know, or my dad treats women, and my dad has affairs all the time. Like, I don't know why you would, you know, that's privilege to do whatever the hell you want, right? Versus it doesn't matter what I do because my life is so there. Who cares? I'm going to get locked up whether or not I did anything just for being Black, you know. So how do we attend to those things? And I think we can structurally build in a way to make sure that we are making sure that these kids in particular are given the same opportunities that these people who are bribing their way out of everything can get. So, but thank you so much specifically for naming caste. It's so important that we keep our eyes on. So I think with that, we should wrap it up. We've gone a little over. Yeah, really appreciate you all so much. Thank you very much for having me. It's just a joy to be in India. It's been a joy to interact so far with CSJ and Enfold to the degree to which I have this time, and looking forward to a few more days here. And thanks again also to Kemp for co-sponsoring this event. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Sujatha. Thank you. It's always such a beautiful gift to listen to you every single time, and such a beautiful gift for you to be here. And we are lucky that we get to spend so much time with you. Thank you so much for that. And every time, I think not only talking about restorative justice, but about your journey, about your personal story, and also about the work which you do and you're continuing to do, and helping out so many organizations here as well. And Swagata so rightly said, the RJ movement in India is impossible without you, you know. And we have, I think you're an integral part of that movement. And thank you so much for this beautiful journey, and also sharing the space and encouraging all of us to think more and think continuously on the same continent. And I think I really want to thank all of you who have come here
personally, physically, on a weekend actually, and so many people have turned up, and also for people who have joined online, and we continue to have those interactions. So very grateful for that, even for the questions which came up here, and even the comments, and so great to hear that the law students have also joined in. So very hopeful. So seeing a very good, I think, beautiful journey just starting up again, and very grateful for the space as well. So thankful to Camp and Enfold, and it is some of the people I would really love to name. Vibha, Kavita, for all the logistical support. Swagata constantly working at it, being constantly for all the coordination and logistical support. Nimita, Archie, and Parvati, of course, from CHGP, and all of you for gathering here. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
We can